Um, Hello, everyone, and good afternoon from Jakarta. And thank you for joining us today, to those who are tuning in from Zoom or from YouTube Live. And welcome to the 5th installment of Digital Discourses, this year with the theme Science Fiction. This conference would not be possible without the help of our organizing partners, Engage Media and Center for Digital Society, and also the collaboration with Smart Change Project for the session, The Future of Smart Cities. Thank you to our partners for supporting this conference. And this year's conference of digital discourses is also part of Goethe-Institut Indonesia's 60 years anniversary celebration. And I would like to also inform you that all digital discourses sessions will be recorded and made available online on cinemata.org. Cinemata is a platform for social and environmental films about the Asia Pacific. So if you miss a session, you can go to cinemata.org and watch the recordings. My name is Yvonne Christiani, project coordinator at Goethe-Institut Jakarta, and I'm happy to be here today to welcome you all. And I'm really excited to listen to our amazing speakers who are joining in from different countries in Southeast Asia and Europe. Especially as a sci-fi fan, I'm really looking forward to the talk and the discussions. And if you're like me and love watching sci-fi series, or if you read sci-fi literature, sometimes I feel like it's kind of dystopian, but somehow took place in our current reality. And with the current development in emerging technologies, it feels like sci-fi is getting closer and closer to reality. But most importantly, this development raises some challenges and questions yet to be addressed. And this is where the focus of today and tomorrow's series of sessions will be. We are going to ask questions such as, will robots replace human labor? Will blockchain transform the internet? Will lab-grown food save the environment? And what is the role of science fiction in imagining the future? Plus, in our closing session, we'll have a reading of our short sci-fi story by our speaker. So you don't want to miss it. And I think no matter what you do and who you are, these tech developments will affect you at one point or another. Our life will not be the same in 10 years' time, but the future is for us to grab and to determine. So I'm curious as to what the speakers envision our present and our future, and keen to listen to the discussion. But before we start, we have a message from our regional director of Goethe-Institut for Southeast Asia, Australia, and New Zealand, Dr. Stefan Dreyer. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Stefan Dreyer. Head Dreyer, please, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Yvonne. Selamat siang from Indonesia. Good afternoon, everybody, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests and friends and partners, and for all of you joining us virtually from various parts of the world, it may be good morning or good evening. It's my pleasure again to open another round, the 5th edition now of our conference series, Digital Discourses. Now, if you have joined our previous conference iterations, welcome back. And we are, of course, glad to see you again. If you are a first-timer, allow me to give you a bit of a background on the event. Digital Discourses was initiated by the Goethe-Institut as a mini conference in 2019. And its purpose was to create a space of reflection, of debate and discussion around issues and topics relating to the digital transformation and the way this transformation is changing our lives. The themes and topics vary from year to year, from conference to conference. And in the last couple of years, we spoke about, for instance, hoaxes and extremism, about data capitalism or journalism in the digital age. What stays the same in each conference, although topics might change, is the exchange of viewpoints, perspectives, and from different parts of the world, and especially between Europe and Southeast Asia. This year, we are inviting you to look, as Yvonne already said, to look into the future by investigating the present. Our theme this year is science/fiction. We are witnessing an enormous amount of scientific and technological breakthroughs that seem to be staggering and sometimes implausible at first. Many of those used to be only the results of a sci-fi writer's imagination. Today, they are reality. And some years ago, self-driving cars, for instance, only existed in movies. Now, legal experts are devising laws to govern their use, and insurance companies are assessing what this all means for their business model. Communicating with a machine by using simply our thoughts is another common feature we saw in many sci-fi movies. Now science and research have transformed this into reality. Or to cite another motive from science fiction literature, food production, not from the fields but from the labs, might be an option for the future. All of these advanced technologies open up possibilities for new ways of living together, of interacting with each other, and of solving some of our current problems and challenges. They might be, and they might even provide a glimpse of hope in providing an actionable solution to our man-made climate crisis. However, all of those technologies also pose a number of social and ethical challenges that need to be explored and that need to be answered. New technologies might even require new ways of governing. So in the tradition of this conference series, Digital Discourses, this conference again wishes not only to inform audiences about the transformations we are undergoing, but also to create a wider and a critical conversation about the direction we might be heading to. We have an absolutely excellent lineup of speakers and moderators today and tomorrow, researchers and practitioners, and even a science fiction writer from 8 different countries. And let me take the opportunity to thank all the speakers and presenters and moderators for your participation and for sharing your expertise with us. Finally, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to the organizing partners of this conference for a very, very fruitful collaboration. The Center for Digital Society, with whom we have worked together in previous conferences, and for the first time, Engage Media. I also like to thank Smart Change Project as our session collaborator this year. Thank you all so much for a really trustful and inspiring cooperation, and we are indeed looking forward to more fruitful partnerships. And my thanks, of course, go to our whole team at the Goethe-Institut, especially to Yvonne Christiani, the project manager and moderator of today. And finally, to all the participants, this conference is made for you. It should be a space where you can ask questions and engage in conversations. And I do hope that you all will make and get the most out of the presentations and discussions. Be sure to stay until the last session. I was told to advise you because we have a very special treat for you at the end. Finally, I wish you all an insightful conference, fresh perspectives, and a fruitful exchange of viewpoints. And with that, I give back to you, Yvonne.
Thank you very much for the warm welcome, Dr. Stefan Dreyer. Now, without any further delay, let's go ahead and start our very first session, Brain-Computer Interface, Separating Fact from Fiction, which will be moderated by Dr. Clarissa Ling. Dr. Clarissa Ling is presently a fellow at the Goethe-Hamburger College Aachen, Cultures of Research at RWTH-Aachen University. She's working on a project that relates international systems with social media and climate disasters. Her expertise is in science, technology, and society, as well as comparative media studies. She has published on topics ranging across art science, science fiction, and digital media. Dr. Clarissa Ling, please take over. The screen is yours, and have a great conference, everyone. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Christiane. Good morning to those who are joining from Europe, and also good afternoon to those who are based in the Australasia region. And it so happens that when I was invited to participate in this conference, for which I actually thank Goethe, the Institute Indonesia, Center for Digital Society and Engaged Media, I've actually already moved to Germany. So yeah, so good morning to all of you. So for today, we are actually the opening act for this conference, which is actually on the brain-computer interface separating fact from fiction. So what we'll be learning from our speaker today is that what is this brain-computer interface, or known in its acronym as BCI, its current use, where it's going, and what are some of the ethical challenges. And also, as the opening act of this conference, I feel that it's also my responsibility to kind of set the tone for the conversation going forward. Especially since we are conversing on categories of fact and fiction in the scientific discourse, and what would that actually mean? It is best to be reminded that there is science fiction, as actually have been well articulated early on by Christiane, which is science fiction as a literary genre that spans across different mediums of adaptation. And then, of course, there is also fictions in science, where there are obviously more speculative forms of mental models and thought experiments that sometimes can get mixed up with reality. But more often, one is unable to distinguish without a signpost as to what these two differences are, and the signpost being the kind of conceptual research questions that may be asked. So in the realm of the mind and the brain, we have countless philosophical treatises on control, power, free will, and agency. But how do we reconcile these philosophical ideals with the state of the science, the hard science? So without further ado, let me introduce our speaker for today. He is a Professor Moritz Grosse-Wentrup, who is a full professor and head of the research group Neuroinformatics at the University of Vienna. So he has developed machine learning algorithms that provide insights into how large-scale neural activity gives rise to cognition, and applies these algorithms in the domain of cognitive neuroengineering. So for example, in order to build brain-computer interfaces for communication with severely paralyzed patients, to design closed-loop neural interfaces for stroke rehabilitation, and also to develop personalized brain simulations programs. So what we'll have is that we have Professor Grosse-Wentrup speaking for 20 minutes, and then we'll actually open up the session for Q&A. So feel free to actually start typing in your questions in the chat if you are so moved to do so. And then we will now proceed with the talk by Professor Wentrup.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here. I'm very much looking forward to the discussion. Please do ask all the questions that you have in the chat. I'm very much looking forward to going into these. So I will now share my screen and give you a roughly 20-minute introduction to what brain-computer interfaces are, and where I see the future of brain-computer interfaces and how I think they will and should develop. So you should now be seeing my screen. Okay, so I've given this talk the title From Brain-Computer to Brain-AI Interfaces. So I first want to talk a little bit about what brain-computer interfaces are and what they are used for, what the potentials are. And then I want to make this distinction and argue that we should make a switch from brain-computer to brain-artificial intelligence interfaces. And of course, I will explain more what I mean by that. But let us start to consider what actually a brain-computer interface is. And the generally agreed upon definition is from an overview paper by Jonathan Walpole, published in 2000, so already 22 years ago. And this consensus is that a brain-computer interface is a communication system that does not depend on the normal output pathways of peripheral nerves and muscles. And now this is a pretty complicated definition. Let us pick this apart and see what this means. Yeah? So let us consider, how do we communicate? We communicate, of course, by speech or by gestures, or maybe by typing into a keyboard or into our smartphones, or maybe also by facial expressions, or maybe by using our eyes to communicate something. But when you think about it, any form of communication, whether it's by speech, typing, gestures, facial expressions, requires muscles. So muscles are the output channels for our brain. This is how we interact with the world. And now, unfortunately, there are some terrible diseases that destroy these output channels. And maybe one of the most severe diseases that do that is amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. And I suppose that many of you are familiar with Stephen Hawking, the famous physicist who recently died, who was an ALS patient. And in this disease, ALS, the motor neurons, kind of those neurons in the brain that control our muscles, die. And eventually leading to the so-called completely locked in stage, where, at least we think, the subjects are still cognitively there and conscious, but have no means to communicate anymore, because all of their output pathways via muscles have been blocked by this disease. And now, of course, the goal here then would be to build a system, a brain-computer interface, that allows these patients to communicate with the world by bypassing these muscular peripheral nerves outputs. Now, this is a little bit abstract, so let me show you a video that illustrates how such a brain-computer interface, kind of in its most simple form, works. So this is a rather old video that I hope you can see now. And this is actually something that I recorded of myself as a test subject at the end of my PhD. So you see me here, we are wearing a so-called EEG cap. So these white dots here, these are small electrodes. And with these electrodes, we measure here the electric fields on the scalp, on the head, that our brain generates, because our brain generates electromagnetic fields. And you can measure these electromagnetic fields distributions here on the scalp. And now I try to modulate these fields that my brain generates in order to, let me show this again, in order to control the horizontal position of this cursor on the screen. And this cursor falls at a constant speed, and I'm trying to move that ball to either the right or the left basket as indicated by the arrow in the center of the screen. And the way that I do this is reasonably simple. Yeah, I imagine to move my hands. Because if we think about it, if we move our hands or even just think about moving our hands, then we modulate the activity in the brain regions that control our hands. And for instance, if I imagine to move my right hand, then here over my left motor cortex, roughly here, this is where my left hand is being controlled by my brain, then I can modulate the activity there. And we can read off these activity modulations here with these so-called EEG, electroencephalogram headsets, and then map this modulation of this brain activity to the horizontal position of this ball on the screen. And now this is reasonably simple setup, but you can hopefully envision that this could be used for basic communication. For instance, we could agree that whenever I want to answer a question with yes, I move the ball to the right. And whenever I want to answer a question with no, I move the ball to the left. And then I would have set up a simple binary yes-no communication interface that can be used only by thought and without using any of the peripheral nerve system or the muscles. Now, on a higher level, the way that this works is the following. We need, of course, a brain that wants to communicate, and we need to have some sensors to measure brain activity. And what I've shown you here in the previous video is this EEG, this electroencephalogram, which measures non-invasively on the scalp the electromagnetic fields or the electric potentials generated by these electromagnetic fields of the brain. But there are, of course, many other types of sensors. There are non-invasive sensors, various types, but there are also invasive ones where you actually open up the skull and either put electrodes underneath the skull directly on top of the brain, or even implant these electrodes into the brain. And of course, all of these different types of sensors have different advantages and disadvantages, and also ethical considerations, which I think we'll discuss later. Now, if we have these sensors, though, then what we often need is we need to give our subjects a task. It would be desirable if we could just think what we want to do, and the BCI automatically interprets that. But most of the time, we need some explicit task to make this decoding of our intention more simple. In the previous video, the task was, if you want to say yes, think about moving your right hand. If you want to say no, think about moving your left hand. And after that, essentially the task of the computer scientists and engineers starts, because we now have to process these really complex signals that we record from the brain. And typically, the first step is called spatial filtering, because it's in particular when you measure outside of the brain on the scalp, those signals, that's a mixture of signals that come from all over the brain. So you kind of need to filter out all the noise, all this brain region activity that you're currently not interested in, and selectively focus on those parts of the brain that are currently of interest to you in any given task. Then you get some very complex time series with many different characteristics. And then a signal processing engineer would typically try to find characteristics in these signals that are optimally informative about what the subject wants to communicate. And then in the end, you would have some machine learning algorithm that sees a lot of these examples of how brain signals look like when a subject wants to say yes or no, and then tries to build a classification rule from that for new data tells us what is the current intention of the subject. And this is kind of the generic pipeline. But of course, for each one of these steps, there's an incredible amount of work that has been done to optimize each one of these steps. Now, I have already spoken about these BCIs for communication for severely paralyzed patients, but there are other uses for brain-computer interfaces. Now, for instance, there are also this field of passive brain-computer interfaces. And here the idea is that you don't build BCIs for patients, but rather use it as a tool for augmented communication for healthy users with their computers. Yeah, for instance, I do believe that in the next few years, we will see large companies like maybe Apple or maybe Huawei to build small sensors, brain recording sensors into those earpods that we, our loudspeakers and microphones that we plug into our ears to measure brain activity, and then maybe adapt the interaction of the smartphone with our users, with its users by the current brain state. Yeah, for instance, by reading out, is the smartphone currently providing too much information, too little information? Is the user happy with the interaction, or does something need to be changed? So this is called passive BCI, because here the users do not actively think what they want to communicate, but rather the BCI passively reads out the current state of the user and tries to adapt the interaction of the computer system with the user. I won't talk more about that though, because this is not a field that I'm personally interested in. If you're more interested in that, I advise you to look up the publications by my colleague Thorsten Sander. However, we also work on BCIs for rehabilitation. And I want to show you a video how that works. So this is also a rather old video, 10 years old. And we don't have a stroke patient, but this is our lab technician demonstrating the use of the system. But in real use, and these systems are now used in clinics, you have a stroke patient here. And this stroke patient would not be able to move their arm, or only be very limited in being able to move their arm. However, with this brain-computer interface, we are able to detect whether the stroke patient intends to move the arm. And if we detect this intention, then we can move the arm with this robotic interface according to the intention of the subject. And the idea here is that you kind of reconnect by this brain-computer interface the disrupted sensory motor feedback loop, that action intentions are again linked to sensory feedback from the arms. And by providing the matching sensory feedback to the movement intention, the brain is supported in its plasticity to re-establish the connections that have been severed by a stroke, for instance. Now, this is a very high-level overview of what brain-computer interfaces can already do and what we have seen already 10 years ago. But now, over the past 10 years, we've seen this incredible advances in artificial intelligence. And I like to read The Economist, so I've collected some of those covers here that kind of illustrate how important now AI is also perceived in our societies. So we have here the artificial intelligence, the return of the machinery question, march of the machines, morals and the machine, nowhere to hide, AI spy, the world's most valuable resource, great expectations. So we've seen a tremendous, really, revolution in what machines can do and how intelligent they have become. So it's an obvious question now, if we want to read out what patients want to communicate, whether we can leverage all of these advances, and maybe not have just one cover of The Economist, when thoughts control machines, but hopefully a few more in the future if we generate a real impact in society. And now, how does this in principle work? Well, in principle, all of artificial intelligence is more or less so-called end-to-end. So over the past decades, we have optimized these pipelines here. We have learned with our biological brains how to decode brain activity. Now the idea is to let all of that be done by computers. So we will take this whole pipeline that we've developed over the last decades and replace it by a so-called deep neuronal network that has many, many neurons and many, many layers, artificial ones, and then is given a lot of training data, so kind of a lot of pairs of where subjects do a certain thing that they've been instructed to do, and we get these so-called labels together with the brain activity. And then this deep AI learns automatically how to match that and how to read out the intention of subjects from the electromagnetic fields, for instance, of the brain. Now, this has been tried now for a few years and the results are quite good, but interestingly, they are not really better so far than the results that we have achieved by these traditional pipelines. And I think that is not too surprising in a way, because our biological brains are pretty clever as well. And a large body of researchers over the past 20 years has optimized these pipelines. And we find now that those pipelines that are learned by AIs are very close, essentially, to the pipelines that we have developed with our biological brains over the past 20 years. And in a way that is, of course, nice to see that we've done a good job. But of course, it's also a bit frustrating in the sense that it didn't get a lot better. And now I believe that we can make this a lot better, but we have to take a very different approach. And this is what I call, or it's a term I would like to coin, brain AI interfaces. So our approach for the future is that instead of replacing this whole pipeline here by an artificial intelligence, we use this whole pipeline to actually control an artificial intelligence. So what do I mean by that? Now, let me demonstrate this on what I call a conversational brain artificial intelligence interface. So there are many patients who have what is called Broca's aphasia. These are patients, usually stroke patients, but sometimes this is due to other diseases, who cannot really speak anymore. And the problem here is not only that their output muscles don't work anymore, but really that a stroke can have destroyed large parts of the brain that generate our speech. And the people with Broca's aphasia can only say, or often, of course, there's a spectrum of how severe that disorder is, but they can often only speak individual words anymore. But this complex sentence generation that all of us are capable of usually doesn't work for them. Now we do have AI systems that can generate natural language, text, and speech. So the idea here is to have an artificial intelligence that speaks for these patients. But of course, in order for us to speak for these patients, this artificial intelligence, this, in a way, chatbot, needs to be able to know what it should say. And the way that it works is as follows. We have a patient, a brain that wants to communicate, but can't really generate ordinary speech anymore. And we have a person who wants to talk to that person. And this person then might ask a question. For instance, the person might ask the question, "Good morning, did you sleep well?" And then our patient would like to answer and can then communicate their decision via our normal brain decoding pipeline, from which we infer the cognitive state, maybe yes, indicating I did sleep well. And now the artificial intelligence obtains this yes decision via the BCI, and at the same time has listened to the subject, to the interviewer asking the question. So it knows the question was, did you sleep well? And it knows that there are certain reasonable answers to this question. Maybe I did sleep well or did not sleep so well. And it infers the context of how it should answer via the brain-computer interface pipeline, and then put that out. And the big difference here to the ordinary BCIs would be that we're not only trying to bridge the gap between an intact brain and the outside world, where it was assumed for a long time that only the output channels, the output pathways, the muscle control were damaged, but rather we are working with patients where really a large part of the brain has been destroyed by a stroke. That part, in this case, that generates complex speech. And we want to replace this whole part of the brain and provide a new speech generation output to these patients. And I now want to conclude my introductory presentation by showing you a brief video, a proof of principle of how that actually looks like in real. So here to the right, you see our PhD student, Anya Meunier, and she's asking a question.
Hello, did you sleep well today?
I hope it's loud enough. She said, good morning, did you sleep well today? And now here, Michael is also a student with us. He's demonstrating the system. He's now communicating with his EEG cap whether the answer should be positive or whether the answer should be negative.
No, I did not sleep well today.
And you hear now the chatbot answering.
Are you in any pain?
Now Anya asks, are you in any pain today? Now the AI system passes that input, generates potential outputs to this question, are you in pain today? Then receives the actual intended input, yes or no, from Michael via this brain-computer interface.
No, I am not in any pain.
No, I'm not in pain today.
Would you like to drink something?
Would you like to drink something?
Yes, I would like to drink something.
Is orange juice okay?
Is orange juice okay? You see, it takes some time for the result to be generated because there's a lot of AI running in the background and quite computational resources required, but also Michael takes some seconds to communicate this decision via this PC.
Yes, orange juice is okay.
Would you like to eat something?
Now we're gearing up to something to also demonstrate the current limitations, and with that I will conclude my presentation. So would you like to eat something? Anya asked, and Michael says,
Yes, I would like to eat something.
What would you like to eat?
Now Anya asks, what would you like to eat? Now Michael can't answer that, because at this point with this system, he can only say yes or no, but he can't say pizza. So he now says no, and let's see what the system makes out of it.
I don't know what you're trying to ask me, but I don't approve of your tone.
So the AI doesn't have the information that it needs, and hence it makes something up and says, in this case, I don't know what you're asking, but I don't approve of your tone. I don't approve of your tone is the interpretation of the no input that the system received from you. So you see, this is there are still, of course, current limitations, in particular related to how much we can read out of the brain. But I strongly believe that this shared autonomy form is going to be the future of brain-computer interfaces or brain-AI interfaces, where we actually control with our brains complex AI agents that replace those parts of our brains that have been destroyed, for instance, by stroke or some other disease. And if you think about it a little bit, when I'm now speaking to you or when you're speaking to somebody else, I always find it a bit of a mystery how I actually speak. I do roughly know what I want to say, but of course I don't think about every individual word. Somehow my brain has this amazing system that comes up with sentences where most of the time I say, that's roughly what I wanted to say. Sometimes I also think, I wish I had said that differently. but somehow this is still magic and quite a mystery to me. And I feel that in the long run, for those patients who have lost this ability, we will give them these AIs to do it for them. And I would expect that sometimes they say, yes, that is how I wanted it to say. I'm pretty happy with that. Sometimes they might say, I wish I had said that differently. But I think that, and very much hope so, that qualitatively over the course of the next, say, 5 to 10 years, we will have systems that indeed we can give to stroke patients for them to interact again with normal complex language. And that means also being able to interact with people whom they don't know, who maybe don't have the patience or the experience to communicate with them with their speech deficits, and just help them to live a normal life. With that, I would like to conclude, and I'm now very much looking forward to the discussion and to your questions.
All right, thank you very much, Professor Grosse-Wentrup. I noticed in the Q&A session that we already have one question. But before we open to the floor, and everyone please keep your questions coming in, I probably would like to kind of like pose some kind of like quick questions that can also serve as points of clarification as well to the presentation. So one thing I'm curious about in terms of the use of this BCI technology for rehabilitation would be, what would be the minimal state that the patient would have to be in to be able to use it properly? And also given the limitations in terms of the communication between the patient and the AI, like how strong must the intention be? So I guess there must be a certain will for them to want to, you know, get better, right, and regenerate.
Thank you for that question. Unfortunately, I would say it's not a clear-cut criterion. But if you kind of see this whole kind of pipeline from, say, let's talk about language, communication, from what I want to say, how I'm going to form these sentences, into the actual phones that I need to generate, and then have the muscular output that generates these. It's a whole pipeline. And the more of this pipeline is being destroyed, the more needs to be replaced by an AI. And initially, we had this case where we assumed that everything is... I'm very sorry. You can still hear somebody using a drill here in our offices. So if only the output channel is destroyed, but then you can still have this whole intact brain in there. But the more of the brain has been destroyed, the more AI you need to still being able to communicate. And of course, at some point you can ask, how much am I still communicating with that person and how much am I communicating with the AI? And I think that will be a continuous transition. And it's going to be a difficult question then in the end to tease that apart, and indeed one that has ethical implications and of course also deep philosophical implications for what is the mind, what makes us a person, and how much can an AI take over things that we do, where we still believe that we're talking to that person and not to the AI.
Yeah, thank you very much for the answer. So before maybe I pose my second question, I'll take a question from the floor, from the Q&A. This is from Mr. Kamaluddin. Okay, he said here, currently all information is in digital form relating to the topic of your presentation. So how will the fate of information in printed form in the future? And how can AI help digitize printed information? And the roles of AI in use in libraries. I guess is asking how would you translate the technology, the BCI technology that you're using for rehabilitation, for this kind of informational processing, storage, and archiving?
Yes, so I would say that there are two answers. One is, first, without BCI technology, indeed, there are colleagues at the University of Vienna here who use AI technologies to digitalize and also to translate old text. So AIs can be a great tool to process information at a speed that humans just can't do. And if you have trained an AI to decipher some old, not existing language anymore, and you have a lot of documents, of course, you can digitize these and kind of improve the storage over time. This is one way. Now, more in the domain of BCIs. Colleagues of mine are working on this idea that we can also use these BCIs to teach AI systems. Currently, AI systems need to learn from large samples or kind of on their own. Maybe if they start to learn how to drive a car, then they have to drive a lot to learn it. But here the idea could be that you actually do use BCI technology to provide feedback to these AI systems and tell them via the BCI what they're doing correctly and what they're not doing correctly. And thereby kind of have and kind of open the other way, that you kind of help via BCI those AI systems to learn faster and better to reproduce human behavior.
Thank you. So actually, in connection to that question as well, probably one of the concerns that we have, especially in Europe, where the GDPR, right, we have all this data that you're collecting from individual patients, and then it's mixed up with all the other data that's kind of collected elsewhere. How are you going to actually sort between all this data? How are you going to like attribute security levels to this different data? Obviously, personal data would be accorded higher security levels than maybe data from old texts, for instance. How I mean, is there already a setup to deal with that?
A really important and wonderful question. It's not quite clear right now, I would have to say. And I find it indeed very important that we start thinking about these concepts. How do we make communication via BCIs secure and private? Because I think what we often see in new technologies, that kind of technological sectors move ahead and legislation only slowly catches up. And then you have situations where the GDPR is kind of published many years after companies like Facebook and Instagram and so already have kind of changed the world, and sometimes not necessarily for the better. And indeed, I think in BCI research, it is essential that a patient can always say, I don't want to say that. And that you don't decode what the patient is thinking, but that you decode what the patient wants to communicate. And these can be two very different things. And of course, there are different ways to deal with that. You can try to explicitly distinguish between these two cases and try to learn what the patient is thinking, which you should not communicate, via what the patient wants to communicate, what he should communicate. You could also imagine to have a sort of kill switch where a patient can at any point in time kind of stop any interaction with that system. But these are really quite substantial challenges. And we are indeed in contact also with legal authorities to discuss these, how to do that in the future. And I think this will become even more important when we will exploit these shared autonomy principles even more, where these AI systems that help us to communicate will get to know a lot about our personal preferences and about our background. And will, for instance, know that you like pizza more than pasta or rice more than something else. And then the question is, when should these AIs be allowed to divulge that information and when not? And these are really quite critical questions which need to be addressed by our community and which only we're really now beginning to address.
Right. So probably we'll take a little step back and also ask a sort of bigger question. This actually comes from another audience member, Waya Nadiantara. So this person is asking, what do you think would be the main constraint of current BCI development? I think you've probably answered part of it, but maybe you want to add more to it. So he gave an example of AI's mathematical foundation in the 70s and 80s. I think he's talking about the symbolic logic, right? And at the time, computational power and cost are the main constraints. I think that's still the constraint today. So how is it going to make it applicable to everyday life?
So I feel the main constraint is the recording technology, the interface to the brain. So we have ways to measure brain activity non-invasively on our scalps, but that is very, very far from the brain, and you only measure very high-level things. And it's very hard to read out a lot from that. And also it's cumbersome to put them on. You do have the other opportunity to go inside the brain and implant electrodes directly into parts of the brain. But then you're extremely focused and extremely localized. And maybe you will record a few hundreds of neurons, but we have 100 billion of neurons. There's really this trade-off between recording all of the brain at a very bad resolution or recording very, very small parts of the brain at a high resolution. And of course, what we would need is we would need ideally to be able to record large parts of the brain at a high resolution, and doing this also in a secure and medically non-risky fashion. For instance, ideally in the long run, we would have electrodes that can be implanted, fully implanted, and would send out all segments wirelessly, such that you don't have any cables that need to go into the brain or come out, because these can be sources of infection. But then you would need to do all the signal processing of these enormous amounts of data with hardware that may not heat up to more than 40 degrees, because above 40 degrees, you start damaging the tissue. And having these recording technologies, I think that is currently the bottleneck of BCI research.
Well, speaking of bottleneck, there's probably also another bottleneck. This comes from the question from the floor, Endahing Pustakasari. The question is BCI able to detect emotions, right? I guess being able to have a sense of the affective situation of the patient, even if the patient may not know themselves, like what's going on, such as, having, be able to kind of like feel problems with the amygdala, prefrontal cortex, or limbic system. I guess being able to have awareness of things that even the person is unaware of themselves.
Yeah. So if you look into the literature, the answer seems a simple yes. There are plenty of publications that try to decode emotions, and they do that rather successfully. But at a deeper level, I would say it's not an entirely solved problem, because the way that these emotions are usually decoded is that you first need to induce these emotions and then check whether those emotions that you induced are indeed the ones that you can decode. And the way that people often do that is they do that with images or with videos, like images that show very scary content. I don't know, many people don't like spiders, so maybe you have big spiders on that, or maybe you show violent scenes, or maybe you show very pleasant scenes, or very calm scenes, or the scenes where people are very kind to one another. And then you try from the brain activity that you record to distinguish what the people have seen. And then this is interpreted as emotion decoding, and it works reasonably well. But of course, you can't be 100% sure that you're really decoding the emotion, or that you're decoding some aspect that the video changed in the brain that is not an emotion. So it's really hard with this kind of abstract concept of emotions to make sure that what you're decoding is really an emotion and not some, what we call confounder, that has been induced in the brain by these different types of videos. Like a simple example, imagine that all scary videos would have a black background and all pleasant videos would have a blue background. Maybe you're just decoding that people saw a blue background and not a black background, but not the emotion. I personally believe that emotion decoding is possible, but with this caveat that we need to be very careful to check what we are really decoding.
And that probably also suggests the potential use of BCI for therapy purposes, also to decode somebody's phobias or past traumas, and which sometimes maybe the past traumas can have impact on the ability to heal physically as well. But yes, emotions itself is, go on.
Yeah, maybe I may add one thing. So we have a colleague at the University of Vienna who uses BCI technology for therapy in a sense. And the way that he does it is that you get feedback from the amygdala. Yeah, so you're put into an fMRI scanner that measures activity in the amygdala. And then by receiving a visual signal representation of your amygdala activity, you can learn to control the activity levels in that, and thereby learn to better regulate your emotions. So these technologies are being developed and are being considered also for therapeutic purposes.
All right, thank you. So we have another question from Ms. Livina in Tanya asking about how would, I think this probably points to one of the videos that it was showing, the AI generating the AI artificial voice. Like, could the current AI generate our own voice as they talk?
Yes.
I guess they may generate the voice of the user. And does AI make the sentence result as we talk to someone rather than a robot? And does the AI literally put out words as is our brain is constructing them, like we intend to speak that and the AI just kind of like picks up on it and spews it out?
Yeah, thank you. So the first question is a simple yes. Yeah, so there are already AI systems that can synthesize speech according to an individual voice. So if you have a large enough body of voice recordings from a patient, you can synthesize their own artificial sentences in their own voice. So that is already a reality. You can do it. However, now the question is, can you make the AI really speak in the same way as you would speak? And now this is a really interesting, fascinating question to which I would say, maybe, maybe not, we don't really know yet. With those systems, we measure non-invasively, I doubt that we can detect or infer from the recordings how exactly a person wants to say a certain sentence. However, when we become more invasively and maybe start recording directly in speech areas of the brain via implanted electrodes, then I see that that could become a possibility, and that we could kind of get at the level of resolution where we can also infer how a patient wants to say a certain sentence. That being said, these AI systems that generate these sentences, they have to be trained on large data sets of conversations. And ideally, of course, you would like to have such data sets from individual patients, such that the AI can learn to speak how the person whose voice the system is supposed to replace. However, such data sets are difficult to gather. They need to be large. So currently, many of these systems are based on movie databases. And for instance, Friends, this TV series Friends that maybe you know, that is being used. So these AI systems now, to a certain extent, learn how to speak people in the TV show Friends. And of course, that's not how people speak to one another. That's not natural communication. And I believe that over the long run, we need these larger data sets of how people naturally communicate. And that will also lead to these AIs learning to communicate not as robots, but sound more natural to us.
Thank you. We have another question. This question is, would the BSI technology allow our brain to download information from the internet in the future? I guess this is the idea of connecting directly to the network.
Yeah, of course, that's a fascinating question, and one that has driven science fiction authors for a long time. I do not know. So the current challenge is that we don't really understand the neuronal code, meaning we can roughly infer what a patient wants to do. This is a limited set of actions from the neural recordings, but there's so much going on in these neuronal recordings and those neuronal activities that look like noise to us. But that probably is not noise, but that this is very important for how the brain processes information. But we don't really understand yet why these neurons process that information in this way. And if you want to write information into the brain and make the brain adopt this, then I believe that you need first to decipher this neuronal code in order to be able to really write the information into the brain in such a way that the brain can make sense of it. And we don't understand that yet. If we do decipher the neural code at some point in the future, then I believe that in principle it should be possible to also download information directly from the internet or maybe hopefully some more secure source into your brain. But I don't know yet. Will it allow us to upload our consciousness? Of course, there are very nice movies out there right now, and TV shows and so on. And there again, I would say, well, we don't even understand the neuronal code. And we certainly don't understand how our brain brings about consciousness. If at some point in the distant future, we should be able to understand consciousness and understand how the brain generates consciousness, then yes, maybe then we are able to upload consciousness into computers, or also the other way around. But I certainly do not expect to see that anywhere near my lifetime.
So probably to also go a little bit back to reality, given the huge undertaking that you're having here with this particular sort of systems technology development. So could you speak a little bit more about the types of like collaboration that you have to form with experts, right, outside of neuroscience, right, to be able to even test the different phases of this technology?
Yeah. So of course, you need interaction with clinical scientists who take care of the patients. You need interactions with essentially people who build the hardware, so who build recording electrodes or the chips that actually record the signals. Then you need computer scientists as us to decipher all of these signals. And then, of course, you also would like to have psychologists who actually kind of study what impact that has on users. And maybe in the long run, also on a larger scale, social scientists who study the impact on societies at large. Then, of course, you do interact a lot with neurobiologists, because these machine learning pipelines that you build, the more you know about how the brain works, the better you can build these pipelines. And of course, there's then a two-way interaction between neurobiologists. So it's quite an interdisciplinary endeavor. And I imagine that will remain for the future. And that is also, advertising my field a little bit. That is what makes BCIs also so fantastic to research in, that you're not the small community where you only talk to people who work on exactly those topics you work on, but you have to interact with people from very different backgrounds to build these larger scale systems. And that's, of course, always fascinating to talk to people with a very different perspective than you are.
Thank you. So I probably will now go to the slightly more speculative but still scientific realm. So recently, the 2022 Nobel Prize for Physics was actually awarded in the field of quantum information, and one of the winners is actually a scientist from your university, right?
Yes.
So what do you see the impact of quantum computing, right? And there's this development in this field of quantum biology as well in BCI, right?
Yes.
Especially in terms of dealing with large-scale data, and in terms of how do you navigate and store all this data, because it's going to just keep adding on, and you're thinking about storage and space. So, and also in terms of security as well, how quantum computing actually assists in this respect?
Yeah, of course, it's a bit of a long stretch, because at this point, we don't really, let me put it differently. You can ask the question, does quantum information theory, quantum mechanics in general have something to do with the brain? One question, very fundamental, and the other is the more applied one. Can we use the quantum technologies, the secure communication and quantum algorithms to build better BCI systems? So let me first talk about the more fundamental question. So there's this tendency always in science or in neuroscience to say, well, the kind of most sophisticated physical theory that we currently have and we don't fully understand, maybe that's a good theory to talk about how the brain works, because we don't really know how to understand. We don't really understand how the brain works, and maybe to theorists that are so complicated, we don't understand it, they have something in common. Yeah, so in the past, people said, oh, minds, brains are robots or automatons. And now some people consider the question, do we need quantum mechanics to really understand how the brain works? Maybe, maybe not. We don't really know that yet at this point. And there are some famous scientists who do believe that quantum mechanics is important to finally understand where all our intentions come from. And this also goes back to this question whether in the end we're just deterministic agents that just act according to what our brains do, and there's no way that we can influence that, or whether we have some more freedom of choice. And some people argue that this freedom of choice may come from these random processes that we observe in quantum mechanics. But we don't really know yet. We don't have the recording technologies yet to record brain activity at a level of resolution where we could see quantum mechanics. That being said, in the more applied side, there's of course the hope that quantum algorithms could make BCI systems more effective in terms of solving certain computational problems more efficiently. So currently at this stage, those algorithms that can be run on a quantum computer are not yet really relevant for BCIs, but who knows? That might change. In particular, that might change when we move on to a stage where we have really large data sets in BCI and can try to learn things that we currently can't. And the revolution that we've seen in AI over the past 10 years was largely driven by this availability of very, very large data sets. I would hope to see that in the future in BCI as well, and maybe then quantum algorithms can play a role here. Now, in terms of secure communication, where quantum technology is, of course, already used, I think that's particularly relevant for secure communication over long distances. And I don't really see, at least currently, a case where that would be different to any other form of secure communication. So yes, it's probably very important that if you use a BCI to communicate over the internet with the world, that you have secure communication. But qualitatively, I don't see a difference there between using your ordinary output channels or a BCI to communicate securely. Secure communication is important in many applications.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much. It's actually 10 o'clock, and I think we're supposed to end here. And just, are there any burning questions from members of the audience before we end this? So, well, if there's none, maybe I will just probably ask one question and see if you can answer in one sentence. Okay. What would be the greatest challenge that you have to overcome in terms of BCI technology to be able to integrate the messy logics of the human brain with the more like organized logic of the AI system as they presently are in the present state?
We have to design systems that provide an obvious additional benefit to its user. And that's not easy.
All right. Right. So with that, I thank you, everyone, and thank you actually to Professor Grosse-Wentrup for actually for his very illuminating and exciting talk. So now we will now end this session, and in half an hour's time, we will have another session that will be coming up. So please stay online or join back again in half an hour. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you and goodbye.
Bye.